me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not my brother nor my sister, but it's me, O Lord, but I'm standing in the need of prayer. Not my brother nor my sister, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Yes, it's me. It's me, O Lord, I'm standing in the need of prayer. It's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not my father nor my mother, but it's me, O Lord, well, I'm standing in the need of prayer. Not my father nor my mother, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Oh, yes, it's me, O Lord, I'm standing in the need of prayer. Oh, yes, my Lord, it's me, O Lord, I'm standing in the need of prayer. Oh, yes, it's me, O Lord, I'm standing in the need of prayer. Oh, yes, my Lord, it's me, O Lord, I'm standing in the need of prayer. In the need of prayer. Now you will find a little talk with Jesus makes it right. All right. I once was lost in sin, but Jesus took me in, and then a little light from heaven filled my soul. It bathed my heart in love and wrote my name above, and just a little talk with Jesus made me whole. Now let us have a little talk with Jesus. Let us tell him all about our troubles. He will hear our faintest cry, and he answered by and by. Feel a little prayer will turn in, know a little fire is burning. Find a little talk with Jesus makes it right, all right. I may have doubts and fears, my eyes be filled with tears, but Jesus is a friend who watches day and night. I go to him in prayer, he knows my every care, and just a little talk with Jesus makes it right, all right. Now let us have a little talk with Jesus. Let us tell him all about our troubles. He will hear our faintest cry, and he answered by and by. Feel a little prayer will turn in, know a little fire is burning. Find a little talk with Jesus makes it right, all right. Now let us have a little talk with Jesus. Tell him all about our troubles. Hear our faintest cry, answered by and by. When you feel a little prayer will turn in, know a little fire is burning. Find a little talk with Jesus. Find a little talk with Jesus. We'll find a little talk with Jesus. Makes it right. Have a little talk with Jesus. Tell him all about our troubles. You will find a little talk with Jesus. Makes it right. Jesus makes it right. All right.
Good morning. This week we look at Job in the Old Testament, chapter 1, verse 1, and chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. A man in the land of Uz was named Job. That man was honest, a person of absolute integrity. He feared God and avoided evil. One day the divine beings came to present themselves before the Lord. The adversary also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to the adversary, "Where have you come from?" The adversary answered the Lord, "From wandering throughout the earth." The Lord said to the adversary, "Have you thought about my servant Job? For there is no one like him on earth, a man who is honest, who is of absolute integrity, who reveres God and avoids evil. He still holds on to his integrity, even though you incited me to ruin him for no reason." The adversary responded to the Lord, "Skin for skin. People will give up everything they have in exchange for their lives. But stretch out your hand and strike his bones and flesh. Then he will definitely curse you to your face." The Lord answered the adversary, "There he is, within your power. Only preserve his life." The adversary departed from the Lord's presence and struck Job with severe sores from the sole of his foot to the top of his head. Job took a piece of broken pottery to scratch himself and sat down on the mound of ashes. Job's wife said to him, "Are you still clinging to your integrity? Curse God and die." Job said to her, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Will we receive good from God, but not also receive bad?" In all this, Job didn't sin with his lips. I want to begin this morning by encouraging you. This has not been an easy week. Many of us are carrying a great deal of emotional stress. We're having a hard time of letting go of that stress. Maybe we're stressed because we're worrying about our neighbors and friends in neighboring counties who lost everything. Some of us have lost family members. Some of us have lost friends. Others of us are stressed because we feel we've not done enough. We feel burdened by the fact that something so close to us could be so destructive, and we've emerged unscathed. But I think many of us are feeling traumatized, and that's normal. It was described to me this past week by someone in the church that they felt helpless. Do you feel helpless? To be helpless, to feel helpless, is such an uncomfortable position to be in. It means we have no control. It means we are more susceptible to fear, more ready to be on edge. The smallest things can set us off. Certainly, we see how someone like Job must have been helpless. Imagine losing your possessions, your family, your health, pretty much everything. That was the position Job finds himself in by the end of the book. He lost what seemed to be everything. To make matters worse, those around him who, instead of providing support for him, end up blaming him. "Job," they say, "you must have done something wrong. You failed. You messed up. You did this to yourself." There's an old expression about kicking someone when they're down. This must have been how Job felt in such a position of helplessness. Only Job remains steadfast through it all. Steadfast not to curse God, steadfast in not admitting that he failed to be obedient to the Lord. He remains faithful. We must remember, though, that a story like Job is not so much about an event. We don't even know if Job was a real person. It's poetry. But the lessons are what it's important here, because there are a lot of lessons in a book like Job. And I think, depending on when and where we read the book of Job, whether we're in a place of suffering or a place from feeling judged or a place of judgment, a place of stability, we might take away different perspectives depending on where we're at. To trust, but to not understand. That's where a lot of us in East Tennessee find ourselves right now. These kind of tragedies just don't happen here. The mountains are supposed to protect us from hurricanes. Our technology and engineering is supposed to be able to withstand storms. And, well, we learn that life is fragile. And something as powerful as water is not the only thing to remind us of this. We have people in our community dealing ongoing with addictions. We have people in our community dealing with divorce, brokenness in their family. One minute, everything seemed fine. The next, the world's turned upside down. That's Job. That's us. But could it be that the journey of suffering itself is key to understanding and even growing closer to God? Could it be that the way we treat one another in times like this is critical on how we emerge from disasters, suffering, brokenness? There's a book called Everything Happens for a Reason by Kate Bowler. It's described as an account of burdens and weightiness during a deadly illness. Because when Kate was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, she writes about the experience, how people treated her, the things they said, the things they didn't say, the fears she had regarding her future, her family's future. The premise of the book is described eloquently by another blogger named Kevin Spinell. He writes, "As comforters, as believers, it seems we can either become a burden for those who suffer, or we can become a loving presence, a weight that comforts and warms like a soft down comforter." Now, take for instance how many of our neighbors, churches, and organizations were spurred on to action over the last week. Have you ever seen such an outpouring of support? People want to help. People want to help where there's helplessness. Even in their own feeling of helplessness, people want to combat helplessness. It's a neat thing to think about. As it was pointed out last Sunday, when Mr. Rogers talks about looking for the helpers in these kinds of times, we also want to look for the comforters. Job certainly didn't have many comforters in this story. His 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, I think that's how you pronounce those names, I'm not sure. Well, I guess we can at least give them credit for showing up, because at the beginning they sit in silence with him for a week, and sometimes that's all we need to do. Is just be present and not say a word. But then, well, they didn't be very helpful. Eliphaz argued that Job's suffering was a result of his sin. Bildad believed it was Job's children's death was a result of their sins. Zophar, well, he believed Job's suffering was not enough and that he better repent. For the friends, you see, there had to be a reason for all the suffering. Some of us are looking for a reason for what happened in our area. Some are even pointing fingers. But why must there be a reason for suffering at all? Because suffering doesn't make sense. Why would a God who created the world and created us in God's image allow there to be suffering? Theologians call this study of suffering and evil theodicy. That's the study of why there's evil if God is so good. It seems like in the past 100 years, this has been much more of a topic for people as they've tried to explain evil and tragedies, why there's so much suffering. I've heard everything from, well, we're living in the end times, to, well, it's so-and-so's fault, or God is punishing and we better wake up. I often wonder why we spend so much of our time debating questions that we'll never understand, that we do not have really the capacity to understand. Dr. Stanley Hauerwas, in his book, God, Medicine, and Suffering, reminds us that for the early Christians, suffering and evil did not have to be explained. Apparently, it never occurred to the early Christians to question their belief in God or even God's goodness because they were already unjustly suffering for their beliefs. The church pretty much started out in a place of suffering. Rather, their faith gave them direction in the faith of persecution and their general misfortune. He writes, historically speaking, Christians have not had a solution to the problem of evil. Rather, they have had a community of care that has made it possible for them to absorb the destructive terror of evil that constantly, and I mean constantly, threatens to destroy our human relations. We see this. Friends, when has there ever been a time that there's been no suffering? James says in the passage last week, are any among you suffering? Of course, always. We see it every week. But sometimes it's worse than others. So as we try to process all the pain and suffering that's resulted in the last week, what if we simply said, God, we're just going to trust in you. What we do not understand, we're going to trust. And we're going to respond in a way that looks like Christ. Use us, O Lord, to be a community of care that does not contribute to more helplessness, but points people in the direction of the great helper. And I think there are many stories in our community where that has been happening over the past week. You can see it. You can hear about it. But the journey of recovery is only beginning in this area, and we need to realize that the recovery is really a marathon. It's not a sprint here. And just like how stories and events in the media are often going viral and a few weeks later we forget about them, we're going to have to not let that happen in this situation. We're going to have to stay steadfast. We're going to have to pace ourselves as we reach out as a church to our neighboring communities. We're going to need to be helpers. We're going to need to be comforters. We're going to need to be encouragers. And we're going to need to do that ourselves. We're going to need to receive that because we're constantly reminded that life can change in an instant. Just ask Job. So the question becomes, do we have the patience, the resiliency, the spiritual maturity, as James talks about, to not let our fears, our emotional stresses, our triggers stand in the way of being Christians, stand in the way of being Christian community to one another? So let's remember, in the end of this story, which is so important, in all of the hardships that Job faces, all the long, difficult days of murkiness, there's restoration. The worst things are never the last things. In fact, all of Job's health, his family, even his possessions are restored, but not as a reward for good behavior, but because of God's love. And Satan, the adversary, the one that came and said, "Oh, it's impossible," well, he thought he could penetrate the strength of Job, and he was proven wrong. That's because Satan is always proven wrong. In the end, it's God's love. It's God's hope. It's God's peace that will be a victory for all. And I believe as we face many challenges ahead as Christians, how we deal with this tragedy in our community, how we approach an upcoming election even, how we treat one another, our commonality for all these challenges, our unifying factor in everything we do should be to prove Satan wrong. One day, Jesus was traveling from village to village, and he was teaching and ministering to crowds, and he was overcome with compassion because he saw the people as sheep without a shepherd. He saw the helplessness of the people, and he had compassion on them. He saw the people as no one to care for them, and he remarked to his disciples in Matthew chapter 9, he says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask of the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." You see, Jesus knows all about helplessness. Jesus became helpless. He didn't do anything wrong. He suffered. He dealt with the fragility of life that you and I have to deal with. Things that make no sense, that aren't just. But by becoming what seemed to be helpless, Jesus was victorious over the helplessness of the world. He was victorious over Satan. Friends, let's remember that. As we go this week, let us go in peace, let us go in the strength of the Spirit, and let us go with Christ. Amen.